Sometimes the most ordinary Tuesday can become the day that rewrites your entire understanding of justice, courage, and human nature. Sarah Martinez never imagined that walking to her college chemistry class would lead to a confrontation that would be filmed, shared millions of times, and spark a nationwide conversation about standing up to bullies. What started as cruel laughter and a bucket of ice-cold water became something far more powerful, a single moment of retaliation that would expose the hidden cruelty happening on campuses everywhere, challenge long-held beliefs about victims and aggressors, and prove that sometimes the quietest person in the room has the strongest punch. This is the true story of how one college student's split-second reaction to public humiliation didn't just knock out her tormentor, it knocked down barriers, sparked movements, and reminded everyone watching that dignity isn't something you can wash away with a bucket of water. The incident lasted 30 seconds. The consequences lasted a lifetime. Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of person who preferred books to parties, equations to small talk, and silence to confrontation. At 21 years old, she was in her third year of studying chemical engineering at State University, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working part-time at the campus library to help pay for her education. Her thick-rimmed glasses, carefully braided dark hair, and tendency to wear oversized sweaters had somehow made her a target for a particular group of students who seemed to believe that intelligence was something to be mocked rather than admired. The bullying had started small during her sophomore year. Snickers when she answered questions in class, deliberately loud whispers about her appearance when she walked by, and the occasional accidental shoulder bump in crowded hallways. Sarah had learned to navigate around these incidents the way one might navigate around construction zones, with careful planning, alternate routes, and the hope that eventually the obstacles would be removed. Marcus Thompson was the ringleader of this group, though he would have described himself as just a guy having fun. At 6 feet tall with the build of someone who spent more time at the gym than the library, Marcus had coasted through college on a combination of his father's alumni status, modest athletic ability, and a natural charisma that made professors overlook his mediocre grades. He had a way of making cruelty seem like comedy, of turning humiliation into entertainment that others felt compelled to join rather than challenge. Marcus had noticed Sarah during their shared organic chemistry class, not because of her brilliant lab work or insightful questions, but because she represented everything he found irritating about serious students. While he struggled to understand basic molecular structures, Sarah effortlessly solved complex problems. While he charmed his way into study groups where others did his work, Sarah studied alone, mastering concepts through pure determination. Her success felt like a quiet judgment of his laziness, and he had decided to make that judgment less quiet. The campaign against Sarah had escalated gradually over several months. What started with mocking comments had evolved into more elaborate schemes. Marcus and his friends had once rearranged her carefully organized lab equipment, forcing her to spend precious time reorganizing while they watched and laughed. Another time, they had started a slow clap when she entered the lecture hall, turning her academic success into a source of mockery. Each incident was designed to be just subtle enough that reporting it would seem like an overreaction, but persistent enough to make Sarah dread coming to class. Sarah's response had been to become even more invisible. She sat in different seats, varied her routes across campus, and tried to time her arrivals and departures to avoid encounters with Marcus and his group. She had considered reporting the harassment to campus authorities, but the incidents seemed too vague, too deniable. Marcus was careful never to cross obvious lines, and his behavior could always be dismissed as harmless teasing or coincidental encounters. The stress was taking its toll. Sarah's sleep suffered as she lay awake planning how to avoid confrontation the next day. Her grades, while still excellent, required more effort to maintain as her anxiety consumed mental energy she had once devoted entirely to studying. She had started eating lunch alone in empty classrooms rather than risk encountering the group in the cafeteria. Her parents, calling from their home 3 hours away, noticed that their usually cheerful daughter sounded tired and stressed during their weekly phone calls, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to worry them with problems that felt both overwhelming and impossible to explain. Meanwhile, Marcus was enjoying the power dynamics he had created. He liked knowing that Sarah changed her behavior to avoid him, liked the way his friends laughed at his comments about her, liked feeling clever when he devised new ways to make her uncomfortable. He had convinced himself that what he was doing was harmless fun, the kind of teasing that builds character and helps people learn not to take themselves so seriously. The fact that Sarah never fought back or complained seemed to validate his belief that she was uptight and needed to learn how to laugh at herself. The chemistry between predator and prey had been building for months, creating a pressure system that demanded release. Sarah's frustration and humiliation were accumulating like potential energy in a compressed spring, while Marcus's confidence and sense of impunity grew with each successful incident. Neither understood that they were approaching a moment when all that accumulated tension would discharge in a single, violent instant that would change both their lives forever. The stage was set for confrontation on what seemed like the most ordinary Tuesday morning of the semester. The weather was mild, classes were proceeding normally, and hundreds of students were moving across campus with the casual confidence of people who expected their day to unfold predictably. Sarah was walking to her advanced organic chemistry lab, her backpack heavy with textbooks and her mind focused on the complex synthesis reaction she would be attempting that afternoon. Marcus was returning from the gym with 3 of his closest friends, still energized from their workout and looking for entertainment. They had been talking about weekend plans and sharing gossip about other students when Marcus spotted Sarah walking alone across the central quad, following the same path she took every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon. The idea came to Marcus spontaneously, the way cruel ideas often do. Earlier that morning, maintenance workers had been cleaning the outdoor dining area near the student center, leaving behind several large plastic buckets filled with soapy water. The buckets sat unattended, and Marcus saw in them an opportunity for what he would later claim was just a harmless prank. He explained his plan to his friends in quick, excited whispers. They would approach Sarah from behind, douse her with the bucket of water, and film the whole thing for their social media accounts. It would be hilarious, Marcus insisted, just the kind of shock that would help Sarah learn not to take herself so seriously. His friends hesitated briefly, but Marcus's enthusiasm was infectious, and none of them wanted to appear less bold than their leader. Sarah had no idea she was being followed as she walked across the quad, her mind occupied with chemical formulas and reaction mechanisms. She was thinking about the lab procedure she would soon begin, mentally rehearsing each step to ensure she wouldn't make mistakes that might give Marcus and his friends more ammunition for mockery. She had learned to live in a state of constant vigilance, but even the most careful prey occasionally lets down its guard. The attack came without warning. Sarah heard rapid footsteps behind her but had no time to turn around before gallons of cold, soapy water crashed over her head and shoulders, soaking through her sweater, her jeans, her backpack, and her carefully braided hair. The shock of the cold water made her gasp, and soapy liquid filled her mouth and stung her eyes. Her textbooks, notes, and laptop were instantly drenched, representing hundreds of dollars of materials and countless hours of work now potentially ruined. Marcus stood behind her, holding the empty bucket and grinning broadly while his friends recorded the scene on their phones. "Oops," he said with mock concern, "looks like someone needs to learn to watch where they're going." His friends erupted in laughter, delighted by the apparent success of their prank and already imagining the social media attention their video would receive. For several seconds, Sarah stood motionless, water dripping from her hair and clothes, her backpack hanging heavy with absorbed liquid. Students walking nearby had stopped to stare, some pulling out phones to record what they assumed would be either an amusing reaction or an embarrassing breakdown. The quad filled with a tense silence as everyone waited to see how the quiet chemistry student would respond to this very public humiliation. Marcus was still laughing, already thinking about his next comment, when Sarah slowly turned around to face him. Her expression was unlike anything he had seen before, not the embarrassment or tears he had expected, but something far more dangerous. Her dark eyes, magnified behind water-spotted glasses, held a fury that made Marcus take an unconscious step backward. In that moment, months of accumulated anger, frustration, and humiliation crystallized into perfect, focused rage. Sarah had spent years avoiding confrontation, swallowing insults, and trying to make herself invisible to escape torment. But, standing there, soaked and humiliated in front of dozens of strangers, she made a decision that would surprise everyone present, including herself. The transformation was visible to everyone watching. The quiet, careful student who had spent months trying to avoid conflict was gone, replaced by someone Marcus had never encountered before. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, her breathing deepened, and every muscle in her body prepared for action. The prey was about to become the predator, and Marcus was about to learn that even the quietest person has a breaking point. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity but lasted only 3 seconds. In that brief moment, Sarah's mind processed not just the immediate humiliation, but every accumulated slight, every mocking laugh, every deliberate shoulder bump, and every day she had changed her routine to avoid confrontation. The water dripping from her hair wasn't just soapy liquid, it was the final drop that caused years of suppressed anger to overflow. Marcus was still chuckling, expecting tears or embarrassed flight, when Sarah took her first step toward him. There was something in her movement that made his laughter fade slightly, a purposefulness that suggested this wasn't unfolding as he had anticipated. His friends continued recording, assuming they were about to capture either a breakdown or an angry but ultimately harmless outburst that would provide even more content for their social media feeds. "That was pretty funny, right?" Marcus said, his voice carrying less confidence than usual. He was beginning to sense that Sarah's reaction wasn't following the script he had written in his head. "Come on, it's just water. Don't be so serious about everything." Sarah wiped soapy water from her glasses with the back of her hand, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than expected, which somehow made it more menacing than shouting would have been. "Just water," she repeated, her tone carrying a deadly calm that made several nearby students unconsciously step back. "Yeah, just a harmless prank," Marcus replied, but uncertainty was creeping into his voice. He had built his identity around being the dominant personality in any social situation, but something about Sarah's demeanor was unfamiliar and unsettling. This wasn't the defeated acceptance he was used to seeing from his victims. "Harmless," Sarah repeated, continuing to move closer to Marcus. Each step she took seemed to diminish his confidence and increase the tension crackling in the air around them. "Like when you moved my lab equipment? Like when you made jokes about my clothes? Like when you made me afraid to eat lunch in the cafeteria?" Marcus's friends exchanged glances, suddenly realizing that their harmless prank might have been the culmination of a much longer campaign of harassment. They had participated in the individual incidents without considering their cumulative impact, and Sarah's words were forcing them to confront the possibility that they had been engaged in systematic bullying rather than innocent fun. "Hey, look, if you can't take a joke," Marcus began, but Sarah cut him off. "A joke?" Her voice rose slightly, carrying across the quad and attracting even more attention from passing students. "You think systematically humiliating someone for months is a joke? You think destroying someone's property is funny? You think making someone afraid to come to class is entertainment?" For the first time since Sarah had known him, Marcus looked genuinely uncomfortable. The dynamic he had controlled so carefully for months was shifting in ways he didn't understand and couldn't predict. Sarah was no longer the quiet victim who absorbed his cruelty silently, she was something else entirely, something that made his usual tactics feel inadequate and inappropriate. "I think you're overreacting," Marcus said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. He took a step backward, ostensibly to give Sarah space but actually because her approach felt threatening in a way he couldn't quite identify. "It's not like anyone got hurt." That phrase, "no one got hurt," seemed to trigger something fundamental in Sarah. Months of emotional damage, anxiety, lost sleep, and constant vigilance suddenly crystallized into pure, focused rage. Her academic success, her dreams of becoming a chemical engineer, her basic right to feel safe on campus, all of these had been injured by Marcus's systematic campaign of cruelty. The idea that psychological wounds didn't count as real harm revealed exactly how little he understood about the impact of his actions. "No one got hurt?" Sarah's voice carried a dangerous edge that made everyone within hearing distance pay closer attention. "You made me change my entire routine. You made me afraid to speak up in class. You made me dread coming to school. You turned my education into a survival exercise. And you think no one got hurt?" Marcus was now acutely aware that their confrontation had attracted a crowd. Students had stopped walking to watch the drama unfold, phones were recording from multiple angles, and he could feel his carefully cultivated social status beginning to shift. The dynamic that had always worked in his favor, the big, confident athlete versus the quiet, serious student, was inverting in ways that made him panic. "Look, I'm sorry if your feelings got hurt, but," he started, but the phrase "feelings got hurt" proved to be exactly the wrong combination of words. Sarah's restraint, already stretched beyond its breaking point, snapped completely. The apology felt insulting rather than genuine, a dismissal of legitimate grievances rather than acceptance of responsibility. The casual way Marcus minimized months of systematic harassment as hurt feelings revealed that he still didn't understand the magnitude of what he had done. Without warning, Sarah's right hand formed a perfect fist and launched toward Marcus's jaw with all the force she could generate. Years of suppressed anger, frustration, and humiliation powered the punch, along with something else, a desperate need to prove that actions have consequences and that victims don't have to remain victims forever. The punch connected with devastating precision. Sarah's fist struck Marcus's jaw at exactly the right angle with exactly the right force, a combination of physics and fury that produced immediate and dramatic results. The impact made a sound that carried across the quad, not the dull thud of fist against flesh, but the sharp crack that indicated serious contact between bone and bone. Marcus's head snapped backward from the force of the blow, his feet left the ground briefly, and his carefully maintained balance disappeared entirely. He staggered backward 3 steps, his arms windmilling as he tried to recover his equilibrium, but the damage was already done. His legs buckled, his knees gave way, and he collapsed backward onto the concrete walkway with a sound that made everyone watching wince in sympathy. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. One moment Marcus had been the dominant aggressor, confident in his power to humiliate and control. The next moment he was lying unconscious on the ground, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his mouth slightly open, and his usual arrogant expression replaced by the slack features of someone who had been thoroughly and definitively defeated. The crowd's reaction was immediate and varied. Some students gasped in shock, others cheered in approval, and many simply stood frozen in amazement at what they had just witnessed. The girl who had been systematically bullied for months had just knocked out her tormentor with a single punch, and everyone present understood that they had witnessed something significant. Sarah stood over Marcus's unconscious form, her fists still clenched, her breathing heavy, and water still dripping from her soaked clothes. For several seconds, she stared down at the person who had made her life miserable, processing the reality of what had just happened. The anger that had driven her to violence was already being replaced by a complex mixture of satisfaction, shock, and concern about the consequences of her actions. Marcus's friends had stopped recording and were kneeling beside their unconscious leader, checking for obvious injuries and trying to wake him up. Their phones, which had been eagerly capturing what they thought would be Sarah's humiliation, had instead documented Marcus's complete and public defeat. The video they had planned to use for entertainment would instead become evidence of both his bullying behavior and its dramatic consequences. Around the quad, dozens of students were uploading their own videos to social media platforms, sharing the moment when the quiet chemistry student had decisively ended months of harassment with a single, perfectly executed punch. Within minutes, the footage would begin spreading across the internet, reaching audiences far beyond State University and sparking conversations about bullying, self-defense, and the moment when victims decide to fight back. Sarah wiped water from her face again, adjusted her glasses, and looked around at the crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. She felt simultaneously empowered and terrified, proud of standing up for herself and worried about what would happen next. The punch had solved the immediate problem of Marcus's harassment, but it had also created new problems that she hadn't considered in her moment of rage. As Marcus began to stir slightly, making confused noises as consciousness slowly returned, Sarah realized that her life at State University would never be the same. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, taken an action that couldn't be undone, and transformed herself from victim to victor in the most public way possible. Whatever happened next, she would face it as someone who had proven that even the quietest person could fight back when pushed too far. The first person to reach Marcus was his friend Tyler, who had dropped his phone mid-recording to check on his unconscious companion. Marcus was making soft groaning sounds, his eyelids fluttering as consciousness slowly returned, but he remained flat on his back on the concrete walkway. A small crowd had formed around the scene, some students offering help while others maintained distance, unsure whether the confrontation was truly over. Sarah remained standing exactly where she had been when she threw the punch, water still dripping from her hair and clothes, her right hand beginning to throb from the impact. The adrenaline that had powered her attack was starting to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of what she had just done and what it might mean for her future. She watched as Tyler and another friend helped Marcus into a sitting position, supporting him as he shook his head and tried to focus his eyes.
"What happened?"
Marcus mumbled, touching his jaw gingerly and wincing at the contact. His voice was thick and confused, and he seemed genuinely disoriented about his circumstances. The punch had been powerful enough to cause temporary memory loss, leaving him unclear about the immediate events that had led to his current position on the ground. "You got knocked out," Tyler said quietly, glancing nervously between Marcus and Sarah.
"She punched you and you went down hard."
Marcus's eyes found Sarah, and the confusion in his expression gradually gave way to anger and embarrassment. Being defeated by someone he had systematically bullied was humiliating enough, but having it happen in front of dozens of witnesses made the situation exponentially worse. His carefully maintained reputation as someone who could dish out humiliation without receiving it had been shattered in a single moment. "You crazy psycho," Marcus said to Sarah, his words slightly slurred but his anger unmistakable.
"You can't just punch people."
"I'm going to have you arrested for assault." Sarah felt a cold spike of fear at the mention of arrest, but before she could respond, several voices from the crowd spoke up in her defense. Students who had witnessed the entire confrontation began describing what they had seen, and their accounts painted a very different picture than the one Marcus was trying to create. He threw water all over her first, called out Jessica Chen, a sophomore who had been walking to her economics class when the incident began.
"I saw the whole thing. He and his friends planned it."
"This has been going on for months," added David Kumar, a senior who shared organic chemistry with both Sarah and Marcus. "I've seen them messing with her stuff in lab, making comments about her."
"This wasn't random."
More students began speaking up, sharing their own observations of Marcus's behavior toward Sarah. The collective testimony revealed a pattern of harassment that many had witnessed but few had previously acknowledged. The crowd that had gathered to watch a fight was transforming into something like an informal tribunal, weighing evidence and rendering judgment on the broader context of the confrontation. Marcus's friends looked increasingly uncomfortable as more students spoke out against their leader. They had participated in some of the harassment themselves, and the public condemnation was making them realize that their actions might have legal and social consequences they hadn't considered. The video evidence on their phones, originally intended to document Sarah's humiliation, now contained proof of their own involvement in systematic bullying. Campus security arrived within 10 minutes, responding to multiple reports of a fight on the quad. Officer Patricia Williams, a middle-aged woman with 20 years of experience handling student conflicts, assessed the scene quickly and professionally. Marcus was now standing upright but still looking shaky, Sarah remained motionless and silent, and dozens of students were eager to provide their versions of events. "Okay, everyone step back and give them some space," Officer Williams commanded, her voice carrying the authority that comes from years of practice managing chaotic situations. "I need to speak with the people directly involved first, then we'll get witness statements." Marcus immediately began explaining his version of events, portraying himself as the victim of an unprovoked assault. He described the water incident as a harmless prank and characterized Sarah's response as a dangerous overreaction that could have caused serious injury. His account carefully omitted the months of systematic harassment that had led to the confrontation. "She just attacked me out of nowhere," Marcus insisted, touching his swollen jaw for emphasis. "I was just joking around, and she went completely crazy. Look at what she did to my face. I could have been seriously hurt." Officer Williams listened to Marcus's account with professional neutrality, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. But when she turned to Sarah for her version of events, a more complex story began to emerge. Sarah's voice was shaky at first, but it grew stronger as she described months of harassment, the impact on her academic performance and emotional well-being, and the culminating incident with the bucket of water. "I know I shouldn't have hit him," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't take it anymore. He's been making my life miserable for months, and today he humiliated me in front of everyone. I just snapped." The witness statements supported Sarah's account overwhelmingly. Student after student described incidents they had observed, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic harassment that painted Marcus as the aggressor and Sarah as someone who had finally reached her breaking point. Several students mentioned that they had considered intervening in previous incidents but hadn't known how to help effectively. Officer Williams faced a complex situation that went beyond the simple assault that Marcus was claiming. The evidence suggested a pattern of harassment and bullying that had escalated to physical confrontation, with both parties bearing some responsibility for the final violent encounter. The investigation would require careful documentation and consultation with university administrators who specialized in student conduct issues.
"I'm going to need both of you to come with me to file formal reports," Officer Williams announced.
"This incident involves multiple potential policy violations that need to be investigated thoroughly.
Mr. Thompson, you'll also need medical attention for that jaw."
The crowd began to disperse as Officer Williams called for additional security personnel and arranged for Marcus to be taken to the campus health center. Sarah gathered her waterlogged belongings, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to wring soapy water from her backpack. The immediate crisis was over, but the administrative and legal consequences were just beginning. As they walked toward the security office, Sarah noticed that many students were looking at her differently than they had that morning. Some expression showed admiration and approval, others displayed concern or worry, but none showed the mixture of pity and dismissal that she had grown accustomed to receiving. Her act of violence had transformed her social status in ways that months of academic excellence had never accomplished. The security office was a small, sterile space with fluorescent lighting and institutional furniture that seemed designed to make everyone uncomfortable. Officer Williams separated Sarah and Marcus, placing them in different rooms while she completed her initial documentation. Sarah sat alone with her thoughts, replaying the confrontation over and wondering whether she had made the right choice. The consequences were beginning to feel real and serious. Sarah could face disciplinary action ranging from probation to expulsion, depending on how the university decided to handle the incident. She might also face criminal charges if Marcus decided to press assault charges, which could affect her future career prospects in engineering. The moment of satisfaction she had felt after landing the punch was being replaced by anxiety about everything she might have jeopardized. Meanwhile, Marcus was receiving medical attention for his bruised jaw while giving his statement to campus administrators. X-rays revealed no fractures, but the swelling and discoloration were significant enough to require pain medication and a soft food diet for several days. The physical evidence of his defeat would be visible for weeks, a constant reminder of his humiliation. The administrative investigation moved quickly once witness statements were collected and video evidence was reviewed. Multiple students had uploaded footage of the incident to social media platforms, providing clear documentation of both Marcus's initial action with the bucket and Sarah's retaliatory punch. The videos also captured the crowd's reaction and the immediate aftermath, creating a comprehensive record of events. University officials faced pressure from multiple directions as news of the incident spread. Marcus's parents demanded that Sarah be prosecuted for assault and expelled for violence, while other parents and alumni praised Sarah for standing up to bullying behavior. Social media discussions about the incident were generating national attention, with the story being shared and debated across platforms. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the Dean of Student Affairs, reviewed all available evidence before making her initial recommendations. The investigation had revealed a clear pattern of harassment by Marcus and his friends, but Sarah's violent response still constituted a policy violation that couldn't be ignored. The challenge was finding a resolution that addressed both the underlying bullying behavior and the inappropriate response to it. The first meeting between Sarah and university officials took place 2 days after the incident, giving everyone involved time to process events and consult with legal advisors. Sarah's parents had driven to campus immediately after learning about the situation, and they accompanied their daughter to the meeting along with a student advocate who specialized in disciplinary cases. Sarah's mother, Maria Martinez, was a soft-spoken woman who worked as a nurse in their hometown hospital. She had raised Sarah to avoid violence and resolve conflicts through communication, and learning that her daughter had knocked someone unconscious had been deeply troubling. But, after hearing the full story of Marcus's harassment campaign, Maria found herself feeling proud of Sarah's courage even while worrying about the consequences. "We taught her to stand up for herself," Maria told Dean Rodriguez during their meeting. "We just never thought she would need to do it this way." But, if the university couldn't protect her from months of harassment, what was she supposed to do? The question of institutional responsibility was one that university officials were struggling to answer. Multiple students had witnessed Marcus's harassment of Sarah, but none had filed formal complaints, and Sarah herself had never reported the behavior to authorities. The systematic nature of the bullying had been hidden in plain sight, visible to many but addressed by none. Within 48 hours of the incident, the story had exploded across social media platforms in ways that neither Sarah nor Marcus could have anticipated. The original videos, recorded by multiple witnesses from different angles, had been shared thousands of times with captions ranging from "bullied student fights back" to "when nerds attack" to "this is why you don't mess with quiet people." The hashtag Bucket Punch was trending nationally, and the story had been picked up by news outlets across the country. Sarah found herself at the center of a cultural conversation she had never wanted to join. Supporters praised her for standing up to systematic harassment and refusing to be a victim, while critics argued that violence was never an appropriate response to bullying. Conservative commentators used her story to discuss declining respect for authority, while progressive voices pointed to institutional failures in protecting vulnerable students. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what Sarah should have done differently. The attention was overwhelming and largely unwelcome. Sarah had spent years trying to remain invisible, and, suddenly, she was one of the most recognizable faces on the internet. Her social media accounts were flooded with messages of support and criticism, interview requests from journalists, and even marriage proposals from strangers who found her act of defiance attractive. The quiet chemistry student who had just wanted to finish her degree in peace had become an unwilling symbol of resistance against bullying. Marcus was experiencing his own version of internet fame, though his was considerably less flattering. Videos of him being knocked unconscious had been set to music, turned into memes, and shared with commentary about karma and justice. His name had become associated with bullying behavior, and prospective employers who searched for him online would find extensive documentation of his harassment campaign and its dramatic conclusion. The pressure on Marcus's family was intense and immediate. His father, Robert Thompson, was a successful attorney who had used his alumni connections to help secure Marcus's admission to State University. The public embarrassment of having his son exposed as a bully, and then defeated by his victim, threatened both the family's reputation and Robert's standing in their community. "This has gotten completely out of hand," Robert Thompson told the local newspaper when contacted for comment. "My son made a mistake with a harmless prank, and now his entire future is being destroyed by an internet mob that doesn't understand the full situation." But the full situation was exactly what many people felt they understood too well. The systematic nature of Marcus's harassment, documented through witness statements and social media posts, revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond a single harmless prank. Students began sharing their own stories of similar harassment, and Marcus's name became attached to broader conversations about campus bullying and the failure of institutions to protect vulnerable students. The university administration found itself caught between competing pressures and public scrutiny. Alumni donors were divided in their reactions, with some demanding harsh punishment for Sarah's violence and others threatening to withdraw support if the university didn't address the underlying harassment that had caused the confrontation. The incident had become a test case for how institutions handle complex situations involving both bullying and violence. Dr. Rodriguez worked with a committee of administrators, faculty members, and student representatives to develop a response that addressed all aspects of the incident. The investigation had revealed systematic failures in the university's anti-bullying policies and procedures, and the high-profile nature of the case demanded a comprehensive response that went beyond simply punishing the individuals involved. The disciplinary hearing for both students was scheduled for the following week, but the proceedings were complicated by intense media attention and legal considerations. Marcus's family had hired a prominent attorney who specialized in campus disciplinary cases, while Sarah was represented by a legal aid lawyer who took her case pro bono after being moved by her story. During the hearing, a parade of witnesses described months of harassment that had been visible to many but addressed by none. Professor Janet Mills, who taught the organic chemistry class where much of the bullying had occurred, admitted that she had noticed tension between Marcus and Sarah but had interpreted it as normal academic competition rather than systematic harassment. "I should have intervened," Professor Mills testified, her voice heavy with regret. I saw signs that something was wrong, but I didn't want to get involved in what I thought were personal conflicts between students. I failed Sarah by not recognizing the pattern of behavior and addressing it directly. Her testimony was particularly damaging because it revealed how easily systematic harassment could be overlooked by authority figures who were in positions to intervene. The university's investigation had uncovered similar failures by other faculty members and administrators who had witnessed individual incidents but failed to recognize the broader pattern of abuse. Marcus's defense strategy focused on minimizing the severity of his actions while emphasizing the disproportionate nature of Sarah's response. His attorney argued that whatever harassment might have occurred didn't justify physical violence, and that Sarah's punch could have caused serious injury or even death if it had struck Marcus differently. My client engaged in behavior that was inappropriate and hurtful, Marcus's attorney acknowledged during the hearing. But the response was completely out of proportion to any harm that was done. Ms. Martinez chose violence when she could have chosen to report the incidents or remove herself from the situation. Sarah's defense took a different approach, contextualizing her actions within the broader framework of systematic harassment and institutional failure. Her attorney presented evidence of the cumulative psychological impact of months of bullying, including documentation of Sarah's declining sleep patterns, increased anxiety, and academic stress that went beyond normal college pressures. Sarah Martinez didn't choose violence, her attorney argued. She was driven to a moment of desperation by months of systematic harassment that the university failed to address. When institutions don't protect victims, victims are forced to protect themselves. The hearing also featured testimony from Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist who specialized in bullying behavior and its effects. Dr. Foster explained how systematic harassment creates psychological pressure that can lead to explosive reactions, comparing Sarah's situation to a pressure cooker that eventually releases steam violently when the pressure becomes unbearable. What we see in this case is a textbook example of how persistent harassment can lead to a violent response from someone who would normally never consider physical confrontation, Dr. Foster testified. Ms. Martinez's reaction was the inevitable result of months of psychological pressure that had no other outlet. The disciplinary committee deliberated for 3 days before announcing their decision. Both students would face consequences, but the committee's recommendations reflected their understanding of the complex dynamics that had led to the confrontation. Marcus was suspended for 2 semesters and required to complete anger management counseling and community service focused on anti-bullying education. He was also banned from contact with Sarah and placed on probation that would extend through graduation. His friends who had participated in the harassment campaign received lesser but significant sanctions. Sarah received a formal reprimand for violence and was required to complete conflict resolution training, but she was allowed to remain enrolled and continue her studies. The committee acknowledged that while her response was inappropriate, the systematic harassment she had endured represented significant provocation that mitigated the severity of her actions. The university also announced comprehensive reforms to its anti-bullying policies and procedures, including mandatory training for faculty and staff on recognizing harassment patterns, clearer reporting procedures for students, and enhanced support services for victims of bullying. The incident had exposed systemic failures that demanded institutional changes. Public reaction to the disciplinary decisions was mixed but generally favorable toward Sarah. Many people felt that the university had struck an appropriate balance between acknowledging her inappropriate response while recognizing the circumstances that had driven her to violence. Marcus's suspension was seen as appropriate punishment for his role in creating the situation that led to the confrontation. The legal consequences proved less severe than originally feared. The district attorney declined to pursue criminal charges against Sarah after reviewing the evidence of systematic harassment and the circumstances surrounding the incident. Marcus briefly considered filing a civil lawsuit but ultimately decided against it after his attorney advised him that the extensive documentation of his bullying behavior would make such a case difficult to win. The incident's impact on both students' futures became clear in the months that followed. Marcus transferred to a different university after his suspension ended, seeking a fresh start away from the notoriety that followed him at State University. His academic performance had suffered significantly, and his career prospects were limited by the internet documentation of his behavior. Sarah, meanwhile, found that her notoriety had unexpected benefits along with its obvious drawbacks. She received scholarship offers from organizations that supported students who had overcome adversity, speaking invitations from anti-bullying groups, and mentorship opportunities from successful women in engineering who admired her courage. The transformation in Sarah's campus experience was dramatic and immediate. Students who had previously ignored her now sought her out for conversation, faculty members who had overlooked her began paying attention to her academic achievements, and she found herself with a social circle of supporters who had been inspired by her story. "I never wanted to be famous for punching someone," Sarah told a reporter from the campus newspaper several weeks after the incident. "But if my story helps other people recognize bullying and speak up about it, then maybe something good can come from this whole situation." The interview was Sarah's first public statement about the incident, and her thoughtful, articulate responses further enhanced her reputation as someone who had been driven to desperate action by impossible circumstances. She used the platform to advocate for better institutional support for bullying victims and to encourage other students to report harassment before it escalated to violence. 2 years after the incident that changed both their lives, Sarah Martinez walked across the graduation stage at State University to receive her degree in chemical engineering, summa cum laude. The quiet student who had once tried to remain invisible was now graduating as class valedictorian, her academic achievements having flourished once the systematic harassment ended, and she gained confidence in her ability to stand up for herself. The audience that applauded her achievement included dozens of students whose lives had been touched by her story. The incident that had begun with a bucket of water and ended with a knockout punch had sparked changes that extended far beyond the two people directly involved. Sarah had become an unlikely spokesperson for victims of bullying, and her experience had influenced policy changes not just at State University but at institutions across the country. In her valedictory speech, Sarah addressed the incident directly for the first time in a public forum. Her words were carefully chosen, acknowledging both the inappropriate nature of her violent response and the circumstances that had driven her to that moment of desperation. 2 years ago, I made a choice that I'm not proud of," Sarah told the graduating class and their families. "I responded to months of harassment with violence, and that was wrong. But I've learned that sometimes the most difficult experiences teach us the most important lessons about courage, resilience, and the responsibility we all have to protect each other." She went on to describe the comprehensive anti-bullying programs that the university had implemented in response to her case, the support systems that now existed for students facing harassment, and the cultural changes that had made State University a safer place for vulnerable students. Her story had become a catalyst for positive change that had benefited countless others. "If my experience helps even one student feel safe enough to report harassment, or gives one bystander the courage to intervene when they see bullying happening, then something meaningful has come from a terrible situation," Sarah continued. "We all have the power to create environments where everyone can thrive, but we have to choose to use that power responsibly." The speech received a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, with many audience members visibly moved by Sarah's grace and maturity in addressing such a difficult topic. Her transformation from victim to advocate had been complete, and her ability to find meaning and purpose in her trauma had inspired countless others. Marcus Thompson was not in the audience that day. After completing his suspension and transferring to a different university, he had struggled academically and socially. The internet documentation of his bullying behavior had followed him everywhere, making it difficult to form new relationships or escape the consequences of his actions. He had eventually dropped out of college entirely and was working in construction while trying to figure out his future. The contrast between their post-incident trajectories was stark and telling. Sarah had used her experience as motivation to excel academically and personally, while Marcus had been unable to overcome the shame and consequences of his behavior. The incident had revealed something fundamental about their characters: Sarah's resilience and Marcus's brittleness when faced with real consequences for his actions. Dr. Rodriguez, the Dean of Student Affairs who had overseen the disciplinary proceedings, remained in contact with both students and often cited their case as an example of how complex situations require nuanced responses. The comprehensive policy changes implemented after the incident had become a model for other institutions dealing with similar challenges. The Sarah Martinez case taught us that we can't wait for formal complaints to address harassment, Dr. Rodriguez explained during a conference presentation about campus bullying prevention. We learned that systematic harassment often happens in plain sight, and that institutional responsibility extends beyond responding to reports. We have to actively work to identify and prevent harmful patterns of behavior. The policy changes at State University had been comprehensive and effective. Faculty and staff received mandatory training on recognizing signs of harassment, new reporting mechanisms made it easier for students to seek help, and enhanced support services provided resources for both victims and perpetrators of bullying behavior. The university had also implemented restorative justice programs that focused on addressing harm and preventing future incidents rather than simply punishing wrongdoing. The broader impact of Sarah's story extended far beyond State University. Her case had been studied in criminology courses, discussed in psychology journals, and cited in legislative debates about campus safety. The incident had become a touchstone for conversations about institutional responsibility, the psychology of bullying, and the complex factors that can drive ordinary people to extraordinary actions. Anti-bullying organizations had embraced Sarah as a spokesperson, and she had used her platform to advocate for comprehensive approaches to harassment prevention. Her message consistently emphasized that while violence was never an appropriate response to bullying, institutions had a responsibility to create environments where victims didn't feel driven to desperate measures. "I don't want anyone to think that what I did was right," Sarah told audiences during her speaking engagements. "But I also don't want victims to think that they have to suffer in silence. There are always alternatives to violence, but those alternatives have to exist and be accessible when people need them." Her advocacy work had led to concrete changes in policies and procedures at dozens of institutions. Sarah's story provided a compelling case study for the importance of early intervention and comprehensive support systems, and her articulate presentation of these issues had made her an effective advocate for change. The personal cost of her advocacy work was significant but manageable. Sarah had learned to deal with public attention and criticism, developing a thick skin that allowed her to focus on positive outcomes rather than negative responses. She had also built a strong support network of friends, mentors, and fellow advocates who helped her maintain perspective and emotional balance. Her relationship with her family had been strengthened by the experience. Her parents had initially been devastated by the incident, but they had come to understand the circumstances that led to it and were proud of how Sarah had channeled her experience into positive advocacy. The family had grown closer through the challenge, and Sarah's younger brother had benefited from the anti-bullying skills she had developed. Sarah's career prospects had been enhanced rather than damaged by her notoriety. Engineering firms valued her communication skills and leadership experience, and several companies had specifically recruited her because of her advocacy work and public speaking ability. Her technical skills were excellent, but her unique background made her particularly valuable for companies that wanted to demonstrate their commitment to workplace safety and inclusion. On graduation day, as Sarah posed for photos with her family and friends, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened, isolated student who had endured months of harassment was gone, replaced by a confident young woman who had found her voice and used it to help others. The transformation had been costly and painful, but ultimately redemptive. Marcus's absence from the celebration was notable but not surprising. His failure to complete his education or rebuild his reputation served as a reminder that actions have lasting consequences, and that some mistakes are harder to overcome than others. While Sarah had found ways to grow from her experience, Marcus had been diminished by his, unable to move beyond the shame and regret that followed his exposure as a bully. The incident that had lasted 30 seconds on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring had created ripple effects that continued to spread years later. Students who had witnessed the confrontation still spoke about it, faculty members who had failed to recognize the harassment patterns had changed their approach to student interactions, and administrators across the country had implemented new policies based on lessons learned from Sarah's case. Perhaps most importantly, the culture at State University had shifted in fundamental ways. Bullying behavior that had once been overlooked or dismissed as harmless was now recognized and addressed quickly. Students felt more comfortable reporting harassment, and bystanders were more likely to intervene when they witnessed inappropriate behavior. The environment that had allowed Marcus's harassment campaign to continue for months could no longer exist. As Sarah left the graduation ceremony and prepared to begin her career as a chemical engineer, she carried with her both the trauma of her experience and the knowledge that she had transformed that trauma into something meaningful and positive. The bucket of water that had seemed like the end of her dignity had actually been the beginning of her transformation into someone who refused to be a victim and insisted on being heard. The legacy of that moment would continue to influence lives and policies for years to come, a reminder that even the quietest person can make noise when pushed too far, and that institutions have a responsibility to ensure that no one is pushed to that point. Sarah Martinez had started college as a victim and graduated as an advocate, proving that the most powerful response to being knocked down is to stand up and help others do the same. Her story would be remembered not just as an example of what happens when bullying goes unchecked, but as proof that individuals can create positive change even from the most negative circumstances. The girl who had thrown one punch had landed a blow against systematic harassment that continued to reverberate long after the bruises had healed and the controversy had faded.